Here comes the crescendo!
Welcome to the build guide for my Chieftain Herald of Ash Blade Vortex Bomber, featuring Lone Messenger, Supreme Ostentation, and lots of tattoos. Let's get started. Let's briefly talk about what this build is good at, and perhaps more importantly, what it's not good at. This build is made to be a pure mapping build, and designed with hardcore in mind, so it's quite tanky. It excels at clearing maps with extreme monster density, and as such, it's great for juiced up mapping with mechanics such as Delirium, Beyond, Domination, Abyss, Ambush, Breach, Harbinger, and Ritual. The more monsters, the better. It's also great for delving and heisting if you want to take a break from normal mapping. This build isn't a bosser, and whilst it doesn't struggle with map bosses and can deal with Guardians and Conquerors with relative ease, I don't recommend attempting to farm pinnacle bosses with it. Although you would be able to kill them, the damage really isn't ideal for this type of content. Just don't try to do uber bosses with it, you're going to have a bad time. This build is very similar to that of a standard Righteous Fire setup. You don't need to aim anything, and you just need to maintain your Blade Vortex stacks, which means stopping to cast every second or two. Then you're just shield charging into packs and watching them explode. Vaal Blade Vortex is great for some extra damage against tankier targets like Delirium or Beyond bosses, but it's also great when clearing content like Breach, as the skill will home in and track down monsters, so you can send it to one side of the breach while you clear the other. This build can be leveled in many ways. Personally, I leveled with Splitting Steel through Act 1, right up to Modifiers where I switched to Spectral Helix. I grabbed Herald of Ash in Act 2 and pretty much kept the same setup all the way to Act 9 where I leveled to 72, which is what I needed to equip the gear that I had ready for the respec. I don't really recommend the build as a league starter, but if I was to level it with no gear ready to respec into, I would level with Righteous Fire by using the mastery for regeneration from uncapped fire resistance, and then also make use of Blade Vortex and Holy Flame Totem, so you'd have far less respecking to do once you make it to maps. Taking to Sardio Cleansing Water from the first Labyrinth makes gearing for resistance incredibly comfy, and synergizes well with leveling with Righteous Fire as you'll want to be focusing on fire resistance. Grab Hinakora Death's Fury from the second lab, and Valako Storm's Embrace in the third lab. Since our Uber lab is 2 small nodes, you can just ignore it until much later on when you can completely trivialize it. We're using Cloak of Flame for the body armor slot. Now I've been asked quite a bit about why I'm using Cloak of Flame instead of Lightning Coil. Firstly, this is a preference thing. The build could pretty much function just as well with Lightning Coil, but I prefer Cloak of Flame because of how much you get out of it on a Chieftain. The fire resistance roll grants a huge amount of total resistance thanks to the Tessadio notable, and also provides a bunch of life regeneration from the fire mastery. Cloak of Flame provides 40% of physical damage taken as fire damage, and importantly also works for physical damage over time. This allows us to run the Radikesh minor Pantheon and forego using any kind of bleed or corrupted blood immunity or cleanse, which is important for the flask setup, which I'll be talking about soon. Lightning Coil does provide an additional 10% physical damage shift, but this is limited to hits, which means we'd be more vulnerable to those fizz dots. We're pretty much fully shifting the physical damage we take into other damage types anyway, so we don't need the extra 10%. Importantly, we also make use of the Life Mastery for 15% increased maximum life because Cloak of Flame doesn't have a life modifier. Inside the Cloak of Flame is our main damage 6-link, which consists of Vaal Blade Vortex, Unleash, Combustion, Inspiration, Awakened Fire Penetration, and Awakened Added Fire Damage. If budget is a problem, you can get away with the normal versions of Fire Penetration and Added Fire Damage to begin with. However, if budget is not a problem, you could consider using Awakened Unleash for the extra seal, and replacing Combustion with Awakened Increased Area of Effect, which will make the build feel even sweeter to play. Inspiration is important for mana cost. We have a Corrupted Implicit modifier to grant gem levels to Blade Vortex, which we'll talk about in the endgame upgrades later on in the video. We're also using Dawnbreaker, which provides more of the same stat, and also works for damage over time. With a max roll of 20%, this brings us up to 60% of physical damage taken as fire damage, and because we have 90% fire resistance, this means that 60% of all bleeding or corrupted blood damage we take is being reduced by 90%, which, when combined with high life recovery, is why we're pretty much able to completely ignore any physical damage over time that's applied to us. The Dawnbreaker 3-link is comprised of our cast when damage taken guard setup, which uses Immortal Call linked to Life Tap, so that we're never in trouble even if mana gets drained. Next up, we're using rare items for our helmet, glove, and boot slots, largely due to Eldritch Implicits. For early progression, you're going to want to focus on two main stats, life and fire resistance. As you progress a bit further, you can begin to include chaos resistance too. Let's first take a look at the helmet. We're using a helmet with a Delve suffix modifier which makes 10% of physical damage from hits be taken as fire damage. This can also be taken as lightning or cold because we have 90% max resist to each type. I purchased this helmet with the suffixes intact, but the life regeneration rate modifier is not that important. You can definitely get away with a crafted Corel modifier for 8% physical damage from hits taken as fire damage in the early game too, especially if you have a higher amount of physical damage taken as fire from the shield. The base type is also not very important, so try to find a helmet which has the Delve modifier along with some chaos or fire resistance. Importantly, the +2 to gem levels isn't necessary here either. We can actually get away with the crafted version of this modifier because we're mainly interested in the area of effect. So if your helmet has a decent life roll already and has an open prefix, simply craft the AoE Gems Betrayal mod and you're good to go. If you have no life modifier, you can craft Suffixes Cannot Be Changed and Veiled Chaos, but this does have a small chance of filling all the prefixes. Remember that you can always use Eldritch Orbs of Annulment if this happens. You can also go the more costly route here and use Suffixes Cannot Be Changed followed by Scouring, and then crafting Suffixes Cannot Be Changed again and using a Betrayal Tier 4 Ashling Benchcraft to guarantee a Veiled prefix. Make sure suffixes are full before doing this or you may end up with a Veiled suffix. Before unveiling, craft the Betrayal Minion Life modifier to block it so that you have a higher chance of unveiling the AoE Gems modifier. Once you have the mod, craft Life and you're set. For Eldritch Implicits, we're using an Eater of Worlds modifier for further physical damage taken shifted to elemental damage. Once again, this can be fire, cold or lightning, and a Searing Exarch modifier for increased area of effect. Depending on your budget, you can use the higher tiers of these modifiers by using the rarer Embers and Ichors or upgrading them with Orbs of Conflict, but the lesser versions are good enough. The Helmet 4-link is probably the most important gem setup of the entire build. This is where most of our damage and area of effect comes from. The link consists of Herald of Ash, Divergent Blood and Sand, Divergent Righteous Fire, and Enhance. This build is scaling Herald of Ash buff effect to the extreme, so the quality of Herald of Ash is very important since it provides increased fire damage as part of the buff effect, which then gets scaled up again by all of our increased and more buff effect modifiers. Herald of Ash gem levels are less important as the more spell fire damage component of the buff barely scales. This means we can make use of a level 20 Herald of Ash with 23% quality, and the AoE gem levels modifier will tick it over to level 21, which is the breakpoint for more spell fire damage. We're using Righteous Fire for the more spell damage buff that it provides, but the Divergent quality also provides increased spell damage from the buff, which we're scaling even further with the Enhance. Lastly, the Divergent Blood and Sand grants additional area effect to spells while you're in sand stance, and once again we're scaling this further with the extra quality from Enhance. Next up, the gloves. I'd like to firstly point out that the spell suppression modifier is an endgame craft if you have lots of currency, and not necessary at all. In fact, this is the only spell suppression roll I have on gear right now, and the only other chance I'm getting comes from the Quartz Flask, so it's not very important. The base type isn't important here either unless you do want to roll spell suppression, at which point you'd need an evasion or hybrid evasion base. But you're going to want a base with fractured life, preferably tier 1. From here you can harvest Reforged Chaos until you hit tier 1 or tier 2 chaos resistance, along with another preferable suffix such as fire resistance, life regeneration, attack speed, or spell suppression. You need an open prefix and an open suffix. Remember that you can use Eldritch Orbs of Annulment to safely remove prefixes without removing the fractured life. Craft suffixes cannot be changed, and use a tier 4 Ashling Betrayal Benchcraft to add a veiled suffix. If you get a veiled prefix, you can unveil the Fizz converted to fire modifier and then craft the attack and cast speed focus modifier and you're good to go. If you don't unveil that mod, you'll need to remove it with Eldritch Annulls and go again. A missed suffix will need to be removed with Annulls. If you remove a desired mod, you'll need to start again. The ideal unveil is the focus, attack and cast speed suffix, and then crafting the Fizz converted to fire mod. The focus mod is just really nice for a speed boost on demand while mapping. But one of the most important modifiers on the gloves is actually the Searing Exarch Eldritch Implicit for increased Herald of Ash buff effect. This is a perfect tier 1 roll on my gloves, which has been crafted using Orbs of Conflict to upgrade the tier of the mod. You can get pretty unlucky with these sometimes, so be prepared to spend some currency getting there. However, a lower tier of this modifier will be just fine until you have enough currency to spend. The Fire Damage Leech's Life mod is very important as an additional source of life recovery, which helps us stay topped off all the time during mapping. This one doesn't need to be upgraded beyond a lesser mod. Our glove 4-link setup is basically the do more damage link, which helps us deal with tanky targets. It consists of Arcanist Brand, linked to Life Tap, Wave of Conviction, and Flammability. I only ever use this against targets like Delirium or map bosses. Next up is the boots. The aspect of the spider craft can come from our boots or belt slot. I'm using it on my boots as I had an open suffix, but you may find it easier to craft it on the belt. These boots could be a lot better, but essentially all we need from these is life, resistances, and the movement speed craft with chill avoidance, which can be unveiled or crafted. You can use life or resistance essences until you hit desirable mods with space to craft movement speed. If you have an open suffix, you can then beastcraft the aspect of the spider mod on to finish them off. The Eldritch Implicits are important here too, and you'll need to make use of Orbs of Conflict once again to improve the maximum fire resistance granted by the Searing Exarch modifier to get it to 2%. The Eater of Worlds Implicit grants some extra damage, which is nice too. Our boot link is made up of Arctic Armor, Tempest Shield, and one of our movement setups with Shield Charge linked to faster attacks. The belt slot is once again mostly just for life and resistances. You could make use of this slot to obtain aspect of the spider. For crafting, I'd recommend starting with a fractured base, preferably life, but you can also start with a fractured chaos resistance base like mine here. From here you can spam fire resistance essences or chaos resistance essences if you have fractured life. You're looking for tier 1 or tier 2 for each desirable mod, and an open suffix if you're not beastcrafting the aspect onto your boots. For our weapon, we're using a wand with gem levels and fire damage. A Scepter is slightly better due to the implicit elemental damage also scaling our non-Blade Vortex damage such as the Hinekora explosions, but I had a Fractured Wand so I wanted to make use of that. You want a Fractured Wand or Scepter with either the +1 to physical spell gems mod or the +1 to all spell gems mod Fractured. The all spell gems Fractured will be the more expensive base, but it's also easier to craft. If you have a Fracture like mine, you're going to want to spam Chaos Orbs to hit the +1 to all spell gems. If you have all spell gems Fractured, you can spam Harvest Fizz Reforged to hit +1 to all physical spell gems. You need an open prefix to be able to craft fire damage, so you need to take the chance on a nulls if the slots are full. We're also using the Harvest craft for weapon quality to gain increased area of effect. The weapon is usable as is like mine, but if you have infinite currency, you can attempt to unveil the fire damage modifier or the double damage while focused modifier using metamods and ashling, and finish the weapon by multi-modding. The weapon 3-link is Infernal Cry and Flame Dash linked to Life Tap. Infernal Cry is used to cover tanky monsters in Ash for more damage. For the ring slots, we're using 2 Circles of Anguish. The main mod we're looking for here is the Herald of Ash buff effect. For the second mod, I'm using maximum fire resistance on one ring and fire damage on the other. The synthesis implicits can be very powerful on these rings, but they can also be quite expensive for the very desirable mods. One of the best mods we can get is Onslaught on hit, which allows us to forego using a silver flask. We could also make use of flammability on hit, but it's not necessary. For the amulet, we're using Replica Dragonfang's Flight with +3 to Blade Vortex gem levels. This amulet is far superior to pretty much any other option because it solves reservation and grants a ton of damage. Conveniently, this build doesn't have an anoint that's incredibly important or must have, so right now I'm using it for some extra life and recovery on kill from Blood Drinker. You can also anoint Graceful Assault for Onslaught on kill to avoid using a silver flask if you don't have the Onslaught on hit ring, or you can anoint Blast Radius for increased damage and area of effect. We're using 5 utility flasks to round out the defenses of this build. The Taste of Hate shifts the majority of remaining physical damage we take from hits into cold damage, whilst providing a decent damage boost too. Taste of Hate is also a Sapphire flask, which along with the Topaz and Ruby flask that we're using, these provide a constant 20% less damage taken to all of the elemental damage that we take. The Quartz flask gives us much needed phasing, whilst the Quicksilver is a nice speed boost. I'm making use of the Betrayal crafts for reduced mana cost of skills and life regeneration, whilst also using the Flask modifier for reduced effective curses, which when combined with a few corrupted dual implicits, this makes any curses applied to me have barely any effect. Supreme Ostentation is a timeless keystone that allows you to ignore attribute requirements. This is great for enabling mass use of tattoos, which is exactly what we're doing here. Every single node that can be tattooed is tattooed. We're using a Warrior's Tale dual setup right below the Marauder start location, along with 4 tattoos of the Namahu Makanga to gain 8% to maximum fire resistance. We're also using an ancestral tattoo of Bloodlines in this setup to gain a huge increase to our life and mana recovery rates. We're allocating at least 1 tattoo to each tribe, so this tattoo provides 40% increased recovery rate of life, mana and energy shield. We also have some reduced extra damage from crits here, some regen and some movement speed. We're taking Prismatic Skin of course for the maximum resistances here, and there's a random tattoo to represent the Valaco tribe for the Bloodlines tattoo recovery rate here. And up here is where we're using our Elegant Hubris, which grants Supreme Ostentation. I could have a much better timeless duel here, but there's not many good ones that exist on Hardcore Trade. I'm grabbing these 2 1-point notables for some chaos resistance and some fire resistance. And over here we have 3 more random tattoos for the Bloodlines tattoo to be able to grant more recovery rate. We're taking the skill effect duration wheel along with the mastery for more skill effect duration. That's really important for BB to feel nice to play. Here's some life and some more life here as well. And over here at Avatar of Fire, this is where we're converting most of the physical damage we deal to fire damage. The rest of course comes from the gloves. We've got 50% on Avatar of Fire and 40% from the Fire Mastery. And all of these small strength passives are tattooed with tattoos of the Namahu Warmonger. These are granting chance to explode. I think I have 9 or 10 of them in total. They're really nice for chain explosions combined with Hinekora and Herald of Ash. We're parting down here for life and maximum fire resistance from Barbarism. And then up here, grabbing Sanctuary of Thought, which is massive value. It grants 30% reduced extra damage taken from crits. That brings us up to 50%. And we're using the Mastery for 10% of physical damage from hits taken as chaos damage. Here's some more life and damage. This duel just has more of the same really, life and damage, some chaos resistance too. And over here we're taking life and the AoE notable. These AoE nodes are really important to make BB feel nice to play. And another random tribe tattoo here from Hinekora for the Bloodlines tattoo. And the rest of the tattoos on the small intelligence travel nodes are all the Arohongui tattoos of the Shaman to scale Herald buff effects. I think I have 9 or 10 of these too. Here's some increased damage and AoE again. The Mastery for life regeneration from uncapped fire resistance is spec'd here too. That one is insane value for 1 point. I think I have about 300% uncapped fire resistance, so that's a lot of regeneration. And we're using Elemental Overload for more damage. And the Dex attribute node here is tattooed for additional Dexterity gem level, which hits Blade Vortex for more damage. Up here is where we're slotting Lone Messenger, which comes from the Calamitous Visions unique jewel. This one is massive. We're scaling up about 200% increased Herald buff effect, and then gaining a 50% more multiplier on top of that from this keystone. And the 50% more damage over time with Herald skills is not bad either for Herald of Ash's overkill burn effect. And lastly, over here, we've got some more damage, some fire penetration, and the Mastery for increased fire damage with hits against ignited enemies. That's another 1 point with giant value. And some more life here, and the Mana Cluster for reservation efficiency. For the Chieftain Ascendancy, we're taking Hinekora for those juicy pops, Thessalio and Valako to apply all of our maximum fire resistance to cold and lightning resistance too. Uberlab is 2 small nodes which grant fire damage and regen. For our Pantheon choices, we're using Ralakesh to shore up the build's defenses against bleeding and corrupted blood. The build can also just run through labyrinth traps without taking any damage, which is pretty fun. And we're using the Lunaris Major Pantheon power. This one is really nice for the movement speed that it grants, and 6% reduced elemental damage taken if you've been hit recently, which is pretty much all the time since we have no evasion or dodge. The chance to avoid projectiles is a nice bonus too. With my current setup, the build is able to reach about 3 million pinnacle DPS. That's not including the extra damage from Vaal Blade Vortex. Once my awakened gems have leveled to 5 and I'm able to get a level 21 Vaal Blade Vortex, the damage will be approaching 4 million pinnacle DPS. With a better weapon and the double curse setup using Whispers of Doom, the build should be able to push to about 6 million DPS. This build has 90% elemental resistances and capped chaos resistance. With high rolls on the Dawnbreaker, the Taste of Hate, and the Eater of Worlds Eldritch Implicit on the helmet, is able to fully shift all of the physical damage taken from hits to be taken as other damage types instead, mainly elemental. This means that when our flasks are up, all of the non-chaos damage that we take is first reduced by 90% by resistances, and then lessened by 20% from flasks. The only exception to this is the 10% of physical damage that we take as chaos damage. That portion is reduced by 75% and then not lessened by any flask effect. In addition, 60% of any physical damage over time that we take is mitigated this way too, and the remaining 40% is taken as normal. When combined with the high life recovery rate that this build is able to achieve, these defenses provide a very sturdy character for the intended purpose of mapping. Because this build uses no auras, it's one of the few builds which can run the reduced effect of auras from skills modifier, because it doesn't affect us in any way. We can also run reduced armor and reduce suppressed damage prevented. The build can deal with a few damage modifiers such as Fizz's extra elemental or monster damage quite comfortably. Just don't go stacking too many of them. It's tanky but not immortal. Avoid these modifiers like the plague. My current setup is around 85 divines of investment that is based on the hardcore trade economy prices, so prices may be considerably different in softcore trade. I would estimate that you'd be able to get the build up and running on a budget of perhaps 30 to 40 divines, but you'd have considerably less damage or defenses until you acquire more upgrades. This build can really be pushed to do a lot more damage and be even more tanky if you have tons of currency to spend. I'll list a few of the upgrades you could hunt for if you wish to push it to its limit. The Cloak of Flame can be double corrupted. You're mainly looking for +2 to AoE gems and +2 to duration gems to get +4 to Blade Vortex gem levels, which is a gigantic damage increase. The 50% reduced extra damage taken from critical hits corruption is really nice too. The helmet, boots and gloves can all be crafted with spell suppression, and when combined with an anoint and the bonus from Quartz Flask, this will push the character beyond 50% chance to suppress spell hits, which will further boost tankiness while mapping. When the Awakened Fire Penetration gem reaches level 5, you'll be able to apply exposure with it. At this point, you could consider dropping Wave of Conviction from the Arcanist brand link and adding Elemental Weakness in its place and anointing Whispers of Doom for even more single target damage. And that's about it. The link to the path of building is in the video description below. It includes my current setup and the tree that I'd use at level 100. There's also the link to the character on PoE Ninja, so you can check out any real-time updates and grab the up-to-date POB. Shout out to GGG for the incredible league that Tota has been. I think I'm going to really miss it next league, but I'm excited for what they're cooking up for 3.23. Shout out to my channel members for your ongoing support, it's very much appreciated. And thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe for more content like this in the future. And if you'd like to support the growth of this channel, you can from as little as 99 pence per month. You can find out more by clicking the join button below the video. As always, stay tuned, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.